In this section, we will first study the anatomy of the cardiac silhouette as seen on the X-ray. The black pointer is on the right atrium. Now this is the superior vena cava draining into it, and this is the inferior vena cava draining into it. This is the right ventricle, the pulmonary valve, and the pulmonary conus, which divides into the right and left pulmonary arteries. This is the left ventricle leading to the aorta and the arc of aorta. And this is a small projection of the left atrium laterally. The right border is formed by the right atrium in the heart region and by the superior vena cava above. A small portion of the inferior vena cava may be seen at the lower end. On the left side, the aortic knuckle forms the prominent convexity at the upper end. Below it is a smaller, less prominent convexity occupied by the pulmonary conus. From here, the left heart border starts. A small upper portion is covered by left atrial appendage, and the rest of the heart border is formed by the left ventricle. To revise, right border is a continuous structure, superior vena cava, right atrium and inferior vena cava. The left border is formed mainly by the left ventricle, but the notch between it and the aortic knuckle is covered by the pulmonary conus and appendage of the left atrium. Now let us come to individual chamber enlargement. The right ventricle. Enlargement of the right ventricle enlarges the cardiac shadow more on the left side than the right, but it tilts the apex upwards so that the apex is seen to be raised up. The enlargement of the left ventricle, on the other hand, enlarges the heart shadow only on the left side, and the apex moves downwards and outwards. This is a typical appearance of left ventricular enlargement, where there is cardiomegaly and the apex has moved downwards and outwards. Enlargement of the right atrium is seen as an enlargement of the right heart border bulging to the right of the spine. It is usually associated with right ventricular enlargement also. In this X-ray of cardiomegaly, note the enlargement of the right heart border to the right of the spine, indicating dilatation of the right atrium. This is right atrial hypertrophy. The enlargement of the left atrium first flattens the notch between the heart and the pulmonary conus, thus causing a straightening of the left heart border. This is also termed as mitralization of the left heart border, as it is typically seen in mitral valve lesions. Note the straightening of the left heart border in this X-ray. From the aortic knuckle to the apex, it is a straight line. This is due to enlargement of the left atrium. The second characteristic of left atrial enlargement is the double atrial shadow, seen as a dense, whiter, globular shadow within the heart shadow. This is better appreciated on the right side, where the X-ray contrast is better. Note this typical X-ray of double atrial shadow, an oval, dense white shadow within the heart shadow in a patient of mitral stenosis. Note in the close-up view the dense white shadow within the heart shadow due to left atrial enlargement. This is another X-ray showing a double atrial shadow. Note the straightening of the left border indicated by the green arrow and the double atrial shadow shown by the white arrow. This is left atrial enlargement. The shadow may not always be so clear, but as seen in this X-ray, a faint outline is often seen near the right heart border. Apart from the straightening of left heart border and double atrial shadow, the third sign of left atrial enlargement is elevation of the left main bronchus and widening of the carinal angle. And the fourth sign is an indentation on esophagus appreciated in a barium swallow in lateral view. At this stage, let us also learn the criteria for labeling an X-ray as cardiomegaly. The shape and size of the heart varies with the shape of the chest and build of the patient. So, cardiac size is measured in relation to the chest size and expressed as cardiothoracic ratio. First, Draw a vertical line in midline through the center of the spine. The maximum distances of the right and left heart borders are measured from this line as A and B. Now A plus B gives the maximum transverse diameter of the heart. Now measure the maximum transverse diameter of the chest at its widest portion, measuring between the inner borders of the ribs. A plus B divided by C is the cardiothoracic ratio, which should be less than half. That is, maximum transverse diameter of the heart is normally less than half of the diameter of the chest. If it is more than half, then cardiomegaly is diagnosed. Now let us study the radiological characteristics of some of the common conditions of the heart, starting with the mitral valve lesions. The radiological features of mitral stenosis and mitral incompetence are similar, and we will study them together. There is a straightening of the left heart border due to enlargement of the left atrial appendage, which fills the concavity between the pulmonary conus and the left ventricle. This is also termed as mitralization of the left heart border. The other signs of left atrial enlargement will also be seen, that is the double atrial shadow shown here by the white arrow and elevation of the left bronchus. Secondly, there is enlargement of the left ventricle causing cardiomegaly, that is the cardiothoracic ratio is more than half. The cardiomegaly is proportional to the degree of mitral incompetence and duration of the lesion, and the apex is displaced downwards and outwards. As pulmonary hypertension develops, there is enlargement of the pulmonary conus and the heart border becomes straight up to the aortic knuckle. As you can see here, the pulmonary artery shadow may even become convex and bulge out. With the development of pulmonary hypertension, the upper lobe vessels, which are normally barely seen, become prominent and are seen as branching opacities from the hilum upwards, while the lower lobe vessels, shown here by the red arrow, become less prominent due to vasoconstriction. This is termed as antler sign or inverted moustache sign. With further increase in the pulmonary hypertension, interstitial edema will appear. So thin hair-like lymphatic lines, that is curly B lines in the costophrenic angle and curly A lines in the upper zone will be seen. And the hilar vessel markings will become blurred due to perivascular edema termed as hilar haze. In severe disease, pulmonary edema appears with scattered patchy opacities in the mid zones and lower zones, giving a bat swing appearance. The edema is usually more on the right side. Note the typical patchy opacities of pulmonary edema. This is another X-ray showing a cardiomegaly with pulmonary edema. Note the patchy consolidation more on the right side with fluid in the transverse fissure shown by the blue arrow. This is pulmonary edema. When congestive cardiac failure develops, there is usually an enlargement of the right atrium and ventricle causing a bulging of the cardiac silhouette on the right side as shown by the green arrow. The upper mediastinal shadow looks widened due to dilatation of the superior vena cava shown by the blue arrow. And the right dome of diaphragm may be elevated due to congestive hepatomegaly. In pure mitral regurgitation, the right atrium is so dilated that it forms a distinct convexity on the left border of the heart, and this, with the dilated right ventricle, gives a pentagonal shape to the heart. This is pentagonal heart in mitral regurgitation. Aortic valve disease. Aortic stenosis alone usually does not cause significant dilatation of the heart chambers except at a late stage with congestive failure. However, in many cases, calcification of the aortic valve is seen. Note the site of the aortic valve in the diagram. Aortic incompetence causes marked dilatation of the left ventricle with cardiomegaly in outward and downward direction. Note the typical left ventricular enlargement in this case of aortic incompetence. In contrast to the mitral heart, this X-ray shows no left atrial prominence and there is a pure left ventricular enlargement carrying the apex downwards and outwards. Now let us come to congenital heart diseases and first study the two common shunts, atrial septal defect and ventricular septal defect. Whenever there is a left to right shunt, the pulmonary artery is very prominent at the hilum and its peripheral branches are seen clearly, that is, the vascular markings are seen clearly up to the periphery of the lung field. This generalized prominence of the pulmonary vasculature due to increased pulmonary blood flow is termed as shunt vascularity or pulmonary plethora. If the chest is observed on fluoroscopy, the pulsations of the pulmonary artery are seen prominently, termed as a Huyler dance. This Huyler dance is another feature of a left to right shunt. So whenever shunt vascularity is seen, that is a prominent pulmonary artery, prominent vascular markings up to the periphery of the lungs, and Huyler dance on screening, we know that a left to right shunt exists. In atrial septal defect, the X-ray may be normal if the defect is small. Later, the heart shadow shows right atrial and right ventricular enlargement. In ventricular septal defect, the heart shadow shows a left ventricular enlargement with very prominent pulmonary conus. With a small defect, X-ray may be normal. Note here the prominent pulmonary conus in ventricular septal defect. In tetralogy of Fallot, the heart has a characteristic shape likened to a Dutch shoe termed as a boot-shaped heart. The apex, shown by the red arrow, is lifted up due to right ventricular enlargement. The pulmonary conus, shown by the vertical green arrow, is concave or shallow as there is pulmonary stenosis. And overall pulmonary vascular shadows are reduced, that is pulmonary oligemia. In this X-ray, note the typical boot-shaped heart with apex lifted upwards and a concave pulmonary conus shown by the green arrow. This X-ray shows the aortic knuckle on the left side, but in 25% of the patients of tetralogy of Fallot, the aortic arc is on the right side. In coarctation of aorta, the left border of the aortic knuckle and descending aorta may show the classic 3 sign if the coarctation is situated on the descending part of the arc of aorta. It is the site of coarctation itself with pre and post stenotic dilatations above and below. The heart shows left ventricular hypertrophy seen as cardiomegaly with apex displaced downwards and outwards. And in long-standing cases, the 3rd to 9th ribs show notching of the inferior border of the ribs in their posterolateral aspects. Note in close-up view the notching of the inferior border of the ribs in this case of coarctation of aorta. This notching is due to the dilated posterior intercostal arteries. In this X-ray, rib notching is present only on the right side, which means that the coarctation is proximal to the origin of the left subclavian artery. Note the wide and dilated aortic knuckle. Pericardial effusion. A pericardial effusion is detected on plain X-ray only when 150 to 200 ml of fluid is collected in the pericardial cavity. The heart shadow is enlarged and all the notches are blunted out, giving a smooth flask-like appearance termed as a leather bottle heart. The heart border is very sharp as the movements of the heart pulsation are blunted by the fluid, but the cardiophrenic angles are sharp and acute, unlike left ventricular hypertrophy. The cardiomegaly is massive with large amount of fluid collected in the pericardial cavity. Now see this X-ray with a massive pericardial effusion. Note the globular or leather bottle heart. Note the sharp and stenciled heart border. Note that both cardiophrenic angles are acute. Compare the obtuse left cardiophrenic angle in left ventricular hypertrophy with the acute left cardiophrenic angle in pericardial effusion. Note again the left cardiophrenic angle in left ventricular hypertrophy and the acute angle in pericardial effusion. This is another X-ray showing a large pericardial effusion. Note the typical flask shape, sharp stenciled hard borders, blunting of all notches, acute cardiophrenic angles, and reduced pulmonary vascular shadows. In this X-ray, note the thin rim of calcification along the left heart border. This is pericardial calcification. Pericardial calcification suggests constrictive pericarditis where there is no significant cardiomegaly but patchy calcification of the pericardium. Dextrocardia. When the main cardiac shadow lies to the right of the midline, dextrocardia should be suspected, provided that there is no significant lung lesion pushing or pulling the heart to the right side. In this X-ray, note that the heart shadow on the right is an absolute mirror image of a normal heart. This is dextrocardia. The apex of the heart is on the right side and the aortic knuckle is seen on the right side. Of course, one must be certain that the X-ray is correctly labeled. If the mark R is mistakenly put on the left side of the X-ray plate, a wrong diagnosis of dextrocardia may be made. So if in doubt, a clinical correlation and fluoroscopy should be done to confirm the diagnosis. In this child, there is dextrocardia with the apex on the right side and aortic knuckle on the right side. Now note that the air in the stomach and intestines is located on the right side with the liver shadow on the left. This is situs invertus where all abdominal organs are also on opposite side. This is another case of situs invertus. Note the dextrocardia with the apex of the heart on the right side, aortic knuckle is on the right, the stomach bubble is on the right with liver shadow on the left. Now observe the lower lung fields. Note the patchy opacities and tiny cystic areas in the medial portion of the lower lobes suggesting bronchiectasis. Clinically, the patient had copious expectoration. This is Cartaginer syndrome, dextrocardia with situs invertus with bronchiectasis. So, in a case of dextrocardia, first check that the X-ray is correctly labeled. Confirm that the aortic knuckle is on the right. If the aorta is on the left, then it is not dextrocardia, but a normal heart pulled to the right by a lung pathology. Then check the stomach air bubble and liver. If they have changed their positions, then it is situs invertus. If situs invertus be present, look for changes of bronchiectasis in the lung fields. Now we will study some more X-rays. This X-ray shows number 1 marked left atrial dilatation which is presenting as a convexity on the left heart border. Number 2 left ventricular enlargement with downward and outward displacement of the apex, a picture consistent with mitral regurgitation. Number 3 prominent upper zone vessels suggesting pulmonary hypertension, and number 4 patchy opacities on the right side due to pulmonary edema. Now this is a diagrammatic representation of the same X-ray. Left atrial dilatation, left ventricular hypertrophy, prominent upper zone vessels and pulmonary edema. See the X-ray again. Left atrial dilatation, left ventricular hypertrophy, prominent upper zone vessels and pulmonary edema. This X-ray shows number 1 a prominent pulmonary conus and vessels. Number 2 left ventricular hypertrophy and straightening of the left heart border. Number 3 right atrial and ventricular enlargement, and number 4 prominent upper zone vessels of pulmonary hypertension. This is the diagrammatic representation showing prominent pulmonary conus, straight left heart border and right ventricular hypertrophy. In this X-ray, the blue vertical arrow points to the prominent upper zone vessels. The left heart border is straight and shows left ventricular hypertrophy. The right heart border shows dilatation of the right atrium and ventricle, and in its upper portion, dilatation of the superior vena cava, seen as a widening of the mediastinum on the right. Dilatation of superior vena cava is a sign of right heart failure. Standing X-ray of the abdomen. A standing X-ray of the abdomen is asked for in patients with acute abdominal pain and is of great diagnostic value in detecting perforative peritonitis and intestinal obstruction. The characteristic feature of an intestinal perforation is presence of free gas under diaphragm, and the picture of intestinal obstruction is of multiple air fluid levels. Gas under diaphragm. In a standing X-ray of the abdomen, free gas in the peritoneal cavity rises to the highest level and comes to lie under the diaphragms, more commonly under the right dome of diaphragm above the liver. Note the crescent-shaped black, that is radiolucent shadow of gas under the right diaphragm shown by the red arrow. This X-ray shows massive amount of gas under the right diaphragm with a fluid level. When peritoneum contains a lot of fluid, intestinal fluid or pus, then a fluid level is also seen, shown here by a horizontal arrow. In this X-ray, note the very small amount of gas under the right diaphragm. A careful inspection is required to detect small leaks. In the close-up view, observe carefully for the tiny gas shadow between the diaphragm and the liver. This is a standing X-ray of the abdomen showing gas under both the domes of the diaphragm. Note the thin, smooth, dome-shaped outline of both the diaphragms. On the left side, this outlining of the diaphragm tells us that this is not the stomach bubble, but it is free gas under diaphragm. Similarly, on the right side, the thin diaphragm shadow rules out a liver abscess with fluid level. The causes of gas under diaphragm are duodenal ulcer perforation and ileal perforation in enteric fever, that is typhoid perforation. The less common causes are gastric ulcer perforation, colonic perforation, and traumatic perforation of any bowel due to stab injury or blunt trauma. Obviously, if an X-ray is taken in lying down position, the gas will not be seen under the diaphragm as it will come to lie under the anterior abdominal wall. If the amount of gas in the peritoneal cavity is large, as seen in this upright X-ray, then in a horizontal X-ray, it may outline the bowel walls, and the wall of some of the loops of the bowels is seen, as it has air on both inside and outside. Note the bowel wall shown by the blue arrows. This is called as the double wall sign of Rigler. This is another X-ray showing the double wall sign of Rigler. Note the bowel wall seen in absence of any contrast medium due to the presence of free gas around it. In an X-ray taken with the patient in horizontal lying down position, this sign suggests the presence of free gas in the peritoneal cavity. Now we come to intestinal obstruction. An erect film of the abdomen helps not only to diagnose the intestinal obstruction but also to locate the site of obstruction. This is a typical appearance of intestinal obstruction in a standing X-ray of the abdomen. Note the horizontal lines with air above and the radio-opaque fluid below. These are termed as air fluid levels or simply fluid levels. Now in this X-ray, first note the presence of multiple air fluid levels suggesting an acute intestinal obstruction. In a close-up view, study the shadow of the distended loop of the intestine. Here we see a coiled spring appearance or concertina appearance which is characteristic of jejunum. Note how a spring appears, and now note the similarity of this shadow to a spring. This appearance is due to the shadow cast by mucosal folds, that is volvae conjunctis, in the jejunum. This is the coiled spring appearance of a jejunal loop. This is another X-ray showing concertina appearance. So this is a distended jejunal coil. The valvae conniventis occur very close to each other and are seen across the full breadth of the intestine, hence the characteristic coil spring appearance. Now we will see how a low ileal obstruction looks. Note the presence of fluid levels first indicating intestinal obstruction. Now we see in close-up the appearance of the gas shadow, which is very smooth and even, described as a featureless shadow. This is a typical distended ileal loop. The gas shows no pattern and has very smooth border. Also, an ileal obstruction shows many fluid levels as the obstruction is low and many intestinal coils are distended. Now we will study a colonic obstruction or large bowel obstruction. Here, as compared to small bowel obstruction, the air fluid levels are peripheral, reaching the lateral abdominal wall, and the diameter of the loop is much more. But the characteristic feature is the hostrations, which are spaced quite apart at random, not like the concertina pattern of jejunum. This is another X-ray showing a colonic obstruction. Note the large diameter of the bowel, its peripheral location, and the hostrations. The hostrations do not occupy the full breadth of the bowel, they stop in between. The characteristic appearance seen in sigmoid volvulus is a huge single distended loop of large bowel on the left side of the abdomen, often reaching the left diaphragm above, and there are two broad fluid levels that mark the lower margins of the gas shadow. This was an early case that did not have fluid margins. But now we have a diagrammatic representation of what a typical sigmoid volvulus looks like. A large, broad, distended loop of sigmoid colon with two broad fluid levels. Another typical shadow seen in intestinal obstruction is of a duodenal obstruction in the second part of duodenum. Note the two bubbles with fluid levels seen in this X-ray. The red arrow points to the stomach bubble and the blue arrow points to the duodenal bubble. The patient had obstruction in the second part of the duodenum. The large X-ray shows that there is no other gas shadow in the rest of the abdomen, and the barium marks the huge distended stomach which is reaching the pelvis. This is the double bubble sign of duodenal obstruction. It will also be seen in an infant with duodenal atresia. In this X-ray of perforative peritonitis, note the large distended stomach in the left upper abdomen. This is an abnormally large stomach in acute dilatation of the stomach. It usually contains a large fluid level when in erect position. Now note this fluid level on the right side of the abdomen shown by the vertical blue arrow. It is in the liver tissue. Note the gap between the diaphragm and the air. It is away from the diaphragm, so it cannot be a subphrenic abscess. This is a fluid level in an amoebic liver abscess. Before the advent of ultrasonography, it was a standard practice to introduce some air after aspirating an amoebic liver abscess, so that on subsequent follow-up, the size of the abscess cavity is seen on plain standing X-ray of the abdomen. This is another X-ray showing a fluid level in an amoebic liver abscess. Note that its upper border does not match with the diaphragm and that it is entirely within the liver shadow. Also, it does not extend along the full width of the diaphragm. In comparison, now see this subphrenic abscess following a duodenal ulcer perforation. The blue arrow points to the diaphragm. The air and fluid is loculated between the diaphragm and the liver. Note that the upper border of the air is nothing but the diaphragm. Liver border may or may not be seen depending on the amount of air. But if there is a subphrenic abscess without air in it, air fluid level will not be seen, and the only finding will be a raised hemidiaphragm. Note the raised right diaphragm in this X-ray. A definite diagnosis of subphrenic abscess is not possible on this X-ray. A subpulmonic effusion or a paralyzed hemidiaphragm will give a similar appearance of raised hemidiaphragm. Invertogram. When a child is born with an imperforate anus, an invertogram is taken to define the lowermost point of the rectum. An invertogram is a standing X-ray of the abdomen with baby inverted. The baby is held inverted for 5 minutes so that the gas in the colon comes to lie in the most distal part of the rectum. A radio opaque marker may be placed on the anal dimple and then a lateral film is taken. If the rectum lies above the pubococcygeal line, a line drawn from the lower border of pubis to coccyx marked P and C in this X-ray, then it is a high or supralevator type of imperforate anus. In this X-ray, the gas shadow extends distal to the pubococcygeal line. Now, if the rectum reaches below the lowest point of ossified ischium, then it is a low type or infralevator type of imperforate anus. This one is a low type of imperforate anus. In this invertogram, the gas shadow of the rectum has ended above the pubococcygeal line. Note the vast distance between the anal marker and the gas shadow. This is a high or supralevator type of imperforate anus. Note that the gas shadow ends above the pubococcygeal line. The term KUB refers to a plain X-ray film of the kidneys, ureters and bladder taken mainly to detect suspected urinary abnormalities. It is taken after adequate preparation to avoid intestinal gas shadows and artifacts. A 2-day course of activated charcoal and enzyme preparations to absorb the gases is followed by a mild laxative on the previous night, and the X-ray is taken on empty stomach in the morning. Now let us study how to read a KUB systematically. First, inspect the renal shadows shown here by the stars. In a well exposed film, the soft tissue shadows of both kidneys and the psoas muscles are seen fairly clearly. Note the size of the kidneys and look for radio opaque shadow of a stone within the renal shadows. Then trace the course of the ureters for a stone starting along the tips of the transverse processes from second lumbar vertebra downwards. Then in front of the sacroiliac joints down to the ischial spine where the ureters turn medially to enter the bladder. Then inspect the bladder shadow. The bladder is seen as a faint soft tissue shadow. In a KUB, the lower border of the bladder is along the upper border of the pubic rami. Lastly, inspect the prostatic urethra seen through the symphysis pubis. As a routine, look around at the pelvis, both hip joints and lumbosacral spine for any bony abnormality and for any other abnormal shadow. Don't miss this step just because you found a stone. More than 85% of the urinary calculi are radio opaque and are seen on a plain X-ray KUB. The rarer radiolucent calculi are invisible on plain X-ray and can be detected on IVP or by ultrasonography. This is a solitary stone in the right kidney. Such a dense shadow with stippled border is characteristic of calcium oxalate stones. The shape of the stone suggests that it is lying in the renal pelvis. This X-ray shows multiple renal stones on the right side. The larger stone shown by the arrow is in the renal pelvis and the 4 smaller stones are occupying the calyces. Now observe the soft tissue shadows of both the kidneys. The right kidney is larger, probably due to hydronephrosis. Renal calculi, especially phosphatic calculi, get molded into the shape of the cavity where they lie. Note in this X-ray that the stone has assumed the shape of the pelvis and calyces. This is the characteristic staghorn calculus. The red arrow points to the pelviureteric junction and the vertical arrow points to the upper and lower calyces. This X-ray shows a staghorn calculus on both the sides. The right stone is much larger and shows the shape of the dilated pelvis and calyces. If the stones form in a large cavity or hydronephrotic sac, then they are often multiple, round and smooth and get collected near the bottom of the sac. In the close-up view, see the multiple stones collected at the bottom of a hydronephrotic sac shown by the arrow. This X-ray shows a large number of small, smooth and rounded stones termed as sago stones. They are formed in a hydronephrotic sac. Sometimes, in conditions of hypercalcemia like hyperparathyroidism, multiple myeloma or hypervitaminosis D, the entire renal parenchyma gets filled with small rounded calcified opacities. So on X-ray, we see extensive calcifications in the shape of the kidneys. This condition is termed as nephrocalcinosis. In this X-ray, we are seeing a horseshoe-shaped kidney with nephrocalcinosis. In sharp contrast with a staghorn calculus, nephrocalcinosis may not show any stone in the pelvic calyceal system, but it fills the renal parenchyma. A stone in the upper calyx of right kidney overlies the gallbladder in an antero-posterior projection, and hence it has to be differentiated from a radio-opaque gallstone. Take an lateral X-ray of the abdomen. A renal stone overlies the vertebrae while a gallstone is much anterior to the vertebral column. This one was a gallstone. In this lateral X-ray, the renal stones of this patient are seen to overlap the vertebral body. If a stone lies anterior to the vertebral bodies, it is unlikely to be a renal stone. Ureteric stones. The pelviureteric junction is somewhere around the tip of the transverse process of second lumbar vertebra on the left side and slightly higher on the right side. From there, the ureter descends along the tips of the transverse processes across the sacroiliac joint up to the ischial spine, where it turns medially to enter the bladder. Ureteric stones will be seen along this course. Note this stone in the upper third of the right ureter. It is lying opposite the transverse process of the third lumbar vertebra and has the characteristic vertically oblong shape of a ureteric stone. Now here we see a stone in the middle third of the left ureter. There is a vertical radio-opaque shadow just below the transverse process of the fifth lumbar vertebra. The vertical oblong shape is typical and it is lying along the course of the ureter. In this X-ray, there is a radio-opaque shadow at a very similar position opposite fifth lumbar vertebra on the right side, but has a irregular shape. It may not be a ureteric stone, but may be a calcified lymph node. The shape must also be considered in the diagnosis of a ureteric stone. This is another X-ray showing a ureteric stone at L34 level. It is in the anatomical course of the ureter and has a vertically oblong shape. This is a stone in the lower third of the left ureter. It is between the sacroiliac joint and the ischial spine. A little below this level, the ureter will turn medially to enter the bladder. This is a ureteric stone at the lower end of the right ureter. Any shadow below this level is unlikely to be a ureteric stone. Let me once again trace the course of the ureters in pelvis from the front of the sacroiliac joints to ischial spine and then medially. The ureteric stones are most difficult to detect and often missed when the shadow is in front of the sacroiliac joints. Note this stone overlapping the bone, which may be easily missed on a casual inspection. An IVP was required to confirm that it was a ureteric stone. So the characteristics of a ureteric stone are a vertically oblong shape and its typical location in the anatomical path of the ureters. Now we will see some abnormal ureteric stones. Note the multiple stones in the lower ureter. Such stones can only occur in a ureterocele at the lower end of the ureter. a normal ureter will not develop such abnormal stones. This is another large and double stone at the lower end of the ureter, once again in a ureterocele. Ureterocele is a cystic dilatation of the lower end of ureter due to congenital atresia of a ureteric orifice. In this X-ray, the red arrow points to a cigar-shaped stone in the lower ureter with two more stones in the bladder. This was a case of neurogenic bladder. To conclude, there has to be a structural anomaly or obstruction for such multiple and abnormal stones to develop. Bladder stones are almost always radio-opaque and very often show a typical lamellated appearance. There are two common types of stones in bladder: the oxalate stones, which are spiculated, and phosphate stones, which are smooth and lamellated. This is a typical oxalate stone. It casts a very dense radio-opaque shadow and has a spiculated margin. In a closer view, note the spiculated margin and note that it is much denser than the bone shadow. This is another bladder stone with a spiky margin, an oxalate stones. It has very large spikes. Now this is a phosphate stone. Note the typical smooth and lamellated appearance of phosphate stones. They form in an infected urine and are deposited layer by layer. Hence they have a lamellated appearance. The vertical arrow points to a nidus around which the stone is formed. At this point, let us see some actual stones. This is a smooth rounded white phosphatic stone. This is a finely spiculated brown oxalate stone in the bladder. This is an oxalate stone with large spikes. This is a vertically oblong ureteric stone. And this is a staghorn calculus from the kidney. This X-ray shows a phosphate stone in the bladder indicated by the red arrow and a stone in the lower end of left ureter indicated by the green arrow. Note the position of the ureteric orifice. This is an X-ray of a child with a bladder stone. Apart from the stone, note another opacity below the stone which has a quite similar appearance. This is a soft tissue shadow cast by the penis. Sometimes it may be mistaken for a bladder stone, but it will always extend below the upper margin of the pubic rami. This is an X-ray KUB shown here to demonstrate the importance of taking a separate bladder plate. This X-ray shows a stone in the lower one-third of the left ureter, but the patient had a typical pain at the end of micturition. So, when a bladder X-ray was taken, it was noted that there was another stone in the bladder which was totally missed out in the previous X-ray. Note in the previous X-ray again that a part of the bladder is outside the film. Hence, a KUB should always include a separate bladder film. Now we will see some abnormal bladder stones. Note this X-ray of the bladder. There are multiple round or oval stones with a smooth border. These are multiple phosphatic calculi in a paraplegic patient with neurogenic bladder. This is another X-ray showing multiple bladder calculi. In another plate, they are arranged in the shape of the bladder. Such multiple stones never occur in a person with normal urinary tract. Usually, they are seen in patients with neurogenic or paralyzed bladder or gross distal obstruction with infection. Lastly, we will see a calculus in the prostatic urethra. A stone impacted in the prostatic urethra is seen behind the symphysis pubis in the midline. It requires a careful inspection to note the shadow overlapping the pubic bones. Now this is an interesting sequence of two X-rays. Note the ureteric stone on the right side just below the tip of the transverse process of third lumbar vertebra, shown by the green arrow. After 3 months, the patient came with sudden and severely painful dysuria. The X-ray now showed the calculus in the prostatic urethra. This is another stone impacted in the prostatic urethra. It is vertically oblong, that is, it is a ureteric stone that has descended down, and it is impacted exactly in the bladder neck. Till now, we saw only the typical calculi in the urinary system. However, urinary stones are not the only opacities that are seen on plain X-rays of the abdomen. There are many other shadows, stones, and calcifications which may be seen, and if these shadows overlie the urinary tract, they may be confused for urinary calculi. First, we will study the radio-opaque shadows in the abdomen, which include the gallstones, pancreatic stones, enteroliths, calcified lymph nodes, and calcified liver abscess, and then the radio-opaque shadows in the pelvis, that is phleboliths, calcified guinea worms, sialistic bands, calcified fibroids, ovarian dermoids, calcified vesicles, and prostatic calcifications. Gallstones. A plain X-ray of the abdomen is not the ideal investigation for detecting gallstones, as more than 80% of the gallstones are radiolucent and are not detected on a plain X-ray. This X-ray shows typical mixed stones with multiple spherical but faceted opacities in the right upper abdomen. The characteristic features seen here are the location in the right upper quadrant, the ring-like appearance due to calcification of only the rims, and faceted borders due to friction with each other. Now this X-ray shows a very faint shadow of a single large gallstone, a cholesterol stone. It has a spherical shape and only the rims are calcified, giving it a ring-like appearance. It is not densely radio-opaque like the renal stones and casts a very faint shadow. This X-ray shows multiple calculi arranged in the unmistakable shape of a gallbladder. These are multiple gallstones of mixed type. Note the large number of stones arranged in the shape of a contracted gallbladder. In this X-ray, once again we see multiple calculi in the right upper abdomen. They are also faceted but do not have a ring-like appearance. So a definite diagnosis cannot be made without a lateral X-ray or ultrasonography. These were renal stones. Here we see a single opacity in the right upper abdomen, which could be either a gallstone or a renal stone. Do not give a definite diagnosis from this X-ray alone. This X-ray shows 4 calculi in the right upper abdomen. They could be either gallstones or renal stones. An IVP shows that the stones are lying in the lower calyx of the right kidney. But when the characteristic ring-like appearance due to peripheral calcifications is present, there can be no doubt that these are gallstones. Rarely, the wall of the gallbladder may get calcified and the faint radio-opaque shadow of the gallbladder may be seen on plain X-ray, termed as a porcelain gallbladder. Chronic pancreatic disease may be associated with calcifications in the pancreas or pancreatic stones in the pancreatic ducts, which may be visualized on a plain X-ray of abdomen. This white line depicts the position and direction of the pancreas. It runs across the body of the first lumbar vertebra in the midline and runs upwards towards the left. Any calcification in this zone should arouse the suspicion of pancreatic calcifications. A careful observation will show many calcifications in the position occupied by the pancreas. This is a typical appearance of pancreatic calcifications, in a line going upwards in the left across the first lumbar vertebra. The stones may be in the ducts and also in the pancreatic tissue. This is another X-ray showing pancreatic stones. The calcifications on the right of the first lumbar vertebra and the stones on the left side, which are in the main pancreatic duct, are aligned in a straight line and they cast a very typical picture. Now observe this X-ray carefully. This stone was mistakenly considered as a renal stone. Even an IVP gave a wrong impression as it is overlapping the upper pole of the kidney. But when a proper X-ray was taken, the characteristic picture of pancreatic stones in a line across the first lumbar vertebra was diagnostic. Now note on the lateral view that the stone lies anterior to the vertebrae, so it cannot be a renal stone. A barium meal then demonstrated that it lies in the C loop of the duodenum, confirming the pancreatic origin. Now note this radio-opaque shadow in the right abdomen. It is far lateral from the course of the ureters. It is lamellated. This is a enterolith. Enteroliths form commonly in the appendix. Note this round calcified shadow within the liver. This is a calcification in a liver abscess. Rarely, a hydatid cyst may also get calcified and cast a similar shadow. This could be a calcified liver abscess or a calcified hydatid cyst. Note these calcified shadows in the abdomen. They are very unevenly calcified. They are calcified lymph nodes. Calcification is common in mesenteric lymph nodes. Less commonly, it may be seen in retroperitoneal lymph nodes. Sometimes the lymph node calcification may be very dense. Note the irregular distribution of the calcifications and in a close-up view the uneven pattern of calcification. This X-ray shows a large rounded shadow and a smaller one akin to a stone, and if they were overlying the renal shadow, they would definitely have been mistaken for renal stones. Actually, it was a soft tissue shadow caused by a large neurofibroma in this patient with multiple neurofibromatosis. Compare the two pictures and appreciate the artifact caused by a soft tissue swelling. Radio-opaque shadows in the pelvis. In this X-ray of the pelvis, there are two radio-opaque shadows, one circular and one rectangular. Here you see this circular shadow with a central radiolucency, and this is a rectangular shadow. These are stylistic bands of laparoscopic tubectomy. Circular shadows are the end-on views and rectangular shadows are the side views of the stylistic bands. These are the actual stylistic bands, circular in an end-on view and rectangular in a side view. This is another X-ray showing stylistic bands of laparoscopic tubectomy. Note their characteristic circular shape. And if you observe closely, the central hole can be made out. A very common radio-opacity in the pelvis is phleboliths. Phleboliths are calcifications in thrombosed pelvic veins. They are rounded opacities, and if the vein is recanalized, there may be a central radiolucency. When the shadow is a perfect round, it is more likely to be a phlebolith than a ureteric stone, which is usually vertically oblong. Also, if the shadow is below the level of the ischial spine, it is more likely to be a phlebolith. Here, the vertical arrow points to a stone in the lower end of right ureter, and the red arrow points to an elongated, densely radio-opaque shadow, which is a typical shadow of a calcified guinea worm. IVP shows that it is outside the bladder, and this X-ray shows that there is another similar shadow in the subcutaneous tissues of the thighs, a calcified guinea worm. Note this characteristic calcification. It is a large round calcified mass, and note the position at the level of the pelvic brim posteriorly. This is a typical shadow of a calcified fibroid. Note the shape and position at the pelvic brim. Now this is another calcified fibroid. There are two fibroids, one larger and one small. Both are rounded and unevenly calcified. Note the position just below the pelvic brim. This is another X-ray showing a calcified fibroid. It is a round, irregularly calcified mass just below the pelvic brim. This is another female patient showing an odd radio-opaque shadow within the pelvis. A closer inspection shows that it looks like two teeth. In fact, they are teeth. This is a dermoid cyst of the ovary containing teeth. You can also see stylistic bands of laparoscopic tubectomy shown by the vertical green arrows. But that's an incidental finding. Note the teeth in an ovarian dermoid. This is another case of an ovarian dermoid. Note the tooth shown by the vertical green arrow and the cyst wall shown by the small red arrow. A dermoid may also show bone formation and cartilage which cast a shadow on the plain X-ray. The close view shows some calcification around the tooth, in this case of ovarian dermoid. This X-ray shows calcified spots behind the left pubic bone. These are calcifications in the prostate. This black zone is the area where prostate is located. Any calcification in this zone should make you think of prostatic calcification. The prostate may contain prostatic calculi or may be calcified in a tuberculous affection of the gland. This X-ray shows calcification just above the symphysis pubis, that is above the base of the bladder, but the shape is typical of a middle lobe of prostate. So these are calcifications in an enlarged middle lobe which is protruding into the bladder. The blue arrow points to a perfectly round opacity much below the level of the ureter. It is a phlebolith. There are two more phleboliths on the left side, as you can now see below the left ischial spine. Intravenous pyelography or intravenous urography is the radiological procedure of injecting a radio-opaque dye which is excreted by the kidney to visualize the urinary tract, that is kidneys, pelvic calyceal system, ureters and bladder. Any obstruction in the urinary tract produces a back pressure and dilatation of the proximal tract and the pelvic calyceal system. Compare the normal urinary tract on the right with the dilated tract on the left. The proximal ureter is dilated and the pelvic calyceal system is also dilated. This dilatation of the renal pelvis and calyces is termed as hydronephrosis. The earliest change to be seen on IVP is blunting of the calyces. A normal calyx, as seen on the right side, is crescent shaped with a thin concave border. While on the left side we have the blunting of the calyces. The calyces are dilated and the concavity is reduced. With further hydronephrosis, the calyces become convex and more dilated, termed as clubbing of the calyces. Note in the left kidney, the apex of each calyx has become convex and bulging. In this patient with moderate degree of hydronephrosis, the size of the kidney is increased, the calyces and pelvis are dilated, and the thickness of the renal parenchyma is reduced. Note the opaque stone at the pelviureteric junction causing moderate hydronephrosis. And with a severe degree of hydronephrosis, the kidney and the pelvic calyceal system becomes a sac of water, renal tissue forming a thin wall of the sac. Note the severe hydronephrosis of the right kidney with a huge dilatation of the pelvis and calyces. Incidentally, the left ureter shows a stone but without hydronephrosis. The hydronephrosis may be due to a stone impacted at the pelviureteric junction or a congenital pelviureteric junction obstruction. In this X-ray, note the stone at the pelviureteric junction causing mild degree of hydronephrosis. In the close-up view, note the stone marked S and the arrow pointing to the convexity or clubbing of the calyces. If there is no visible stone, then it is more likely to be a congenital PU junction obstruction, often due to aberrant lower polar vessel pressing on the PU junction or congenital stenosis. This IVP shows right PU junction obstruction. The pelvis is typically extrarenal, large and redundant. Note the sudden narrowing to a normal ureter at the pelviureteric junction shown by the arrow. This is a typical congenital pelviureteric junction obstruction. This is another PU junction obstruction showing a very huge hydronephrosis. Hydronephrosis with undistended ureter is the characteristic of PU junction obstruction. The sudden narrowing to a normal sized ureter and redundant pelvis seen as attachment of the ureter in a non-dependent area is typical. Congenital PU junction obstructions are usually asymptomatic and often develop into huge hydronephrotic sacs by the time they are detected. Renal tuberculosis. In this IVP, the left kidney shows narrowing of the infundibulum of the upper and middle calyx, resulting in dilatation of the upper calyx. Infundibulum is the portion joining the calyx to the pelvis. Edema of the neck of the calyx is one of the earliest changes of renal tuberculosis. In this IVP, the right kidney shows infundibular narrowing as shown by the arrow and hydrocalyx of the middle and upper calyces. The left kidney shows a dilatation of only the upper calyx as shown by the arrow. Hydrocalcinosis of a single calyx is almost diagnostic of tuberculosis of kidney. In this X-ray, observe the renal outline carefully. The nephrogram shows an indentation in the renal parenchyma at the point shown by the arrow. This is due to parenchymal scarring. This is another characteristic of renal tuberculosis. This is a plain X-ray KUB showing complete calcification of the left kidney. This is an advanced stage of the disease where the entire kidney is destroyed and calcified. An IVP shows that it is non-functioning. This is clinically termed as an autonephrectomy, the last stage in renal tuberculosis. Note the complete calcification of the left kidney. This IVP shows a non-functioning left kidney with calcifications which are in the renal parenchyma. Calcification of areas of caseation is another feature of tuberculosis. So the radiological characteristics of renal tuberculosis on IVP are narrowing of the infundibulum or the neck of the calyx, selective hydrocalcinosis, parenchymal scarring, cavitation in renal parenchyma, calcification and autonephrectomy. The adult type of polycystic kidneys are full of multiple cysts and are grossly enlarged in size. Note the soft tissue shadows of both kidneys showing an enlargement. On IVP, the calyces are seen to be stretched over the cysts, resulting in thin and long calyces described as spider leg appearance. Note the elongated, displaced and narrow major calyces shown by the arrows. Now note the stretched and cupped minor calyces at the periphery. The renal border, if seen well on nephrogram, is lobulated due to the cysts on the surface, and the kidneys show a blotchy appearance due to non-opacification of the cysts. So the radiological features of polycystic kidneys are an enlargement of both the kidneys, lobulated border, the major calyces are elongated, stretched and displaced giving a spider leg appearance, and minor calyces show stretching and cupping. Renal tumors or space occupying lesions. In this IVP, observe the right kidney. The middle and lower calyces shown by the vertical arrow are displaced downwards, but their structure is normal. The upper calyx shown by the horizontal arrow is displaced and distorted by a soft tissue mass. You can also see a large soft tissue shadow occupying the upper pole. This is a space occupying lesion or SOL in the kidney. It could be a simple renal cyst or a renal tumor or hypernephroma. It is not possible to differentiate between a cyst and a hypernephroma on IVP. Note the upper polar mass. This is an IVP showing a SOL at the lower pole of the left kidney. The horizontal arrow points to the large soft tissue shadow of the mass with the distortion of the lower calyces. The upper calyx is dilated but not distorted. In a close-up view, note that the anatomy of the upper calyx is maintained while the lower calyx is distorted and spread out within the soft tissue mass. To confirm whether it is a cyst or a tumor, an ultrasound examination or renal angiography is required. In this IVP, the left kidney is normal. The right kidney shows no excretion. but there is a huge soft tissue shadow occupying the right abdomen. The outline of the perirenal fat is seen very well. This is a huge non-functioning kidney. It could be a hypernephroma or a large hydronephrosis. A delayed IVP film may show excretion in hydronephrosis. Ultrasound will be confirmatory. This IVP shows a normal left kidney and a large soft tissue mass on the right side. The border of the soft tissue mass is clearly seen. On close inspection, you can see a few distorted calyces. So this is a hypernephroma. But since no normal calyx is seen, it is not possible to say whether it is arising from the upper pole or the lower pole. This is a plain X-ray of a 2-year-old child. Note the large soft tissue shadow of the left kidney, which also shows calcified areas shown by the blue arrow. Now on IVP, note that there is a large mass at the upper pole which is displacing and distorting the middle and lower calyces, which are shown by the green arrow. The calyces are stretched, elongated and displaced medially. This is a Wilms tumor in a child. This is an IVP of a 4-year-old child. The right kidney is normal. The left kidney shows a soft tissue mass at the upper pole which is displacing and distorting the upper and middle calyces. The lower calyx, shown by the blue arrow, is displaced down but normal. Note the soft tissue mass and the distorted upper calyx. This is a case of Wilms tumor of the upper pole of the left kidney. So the radiological features of a renal tumor are a space occupying soft tissue shadow at the upper or lower pole and displacement and distortion of the calyces. Now we will see some congenital anomalies of the kidneys. Horseshoe kidney. This IVP shows a typical horseshoe kidney. The kidneys are situated very close to the spine and at a lower level than usual. Also, the lower poles are closer than the upper poles, that is, the direction of the axis of the kidneys is also changed. Now coming to the pelvis, it is rotated and ureters are seen to be coming out from the lateral side. The calyces are also rotated and some calyces, in particular the lower calyces shown by the red arrows, appear on the medial side of the pelvis. These are all characteristics of a horseshoe kidney. The isthmus joining the two kidneys is usually at L4 level. The patients with horseshoe kidney are more prone to urinary infections and stone formation. Here we see a stone at L2. On IVP, it is seen to lie in the right pelvis of a horseshoe kidney. Now observe the shape of the kidney. Both kidneys are joined to each other at their lower poles, forming the shape of a horseshoe. This is a horseshoe, and note the similarity in shape and hence the name horseshoe kidney. Another common complication associated with a horseshoe kidney is hydronephrosis. Note the dilated calyces on the left side shown by the red arrow. The ureters are angulated as they pass over the fused isthmus. This results in pelviureteric junction obstruction, stasis, infection and calculus formation. Note the hydronephrosis of the left kidney. The horseshoe shape is well seen and the isthmus usually lies in the front of third or fourth lumbar vertebra. Now we will see the previous X-ray of the patient with the stone again. Note the hydronephrosis on the right side, which is the cause of stone formation. This is another horseshoe kidney. Note the characteristic shape with isthmus in front of the third lumbar vertebra. Now observe the pelvis. On the right side, the characteristic mal-rotated pelvis is seen, and on the left side, dilated calyces due to hydronephrosis are seen. This is left-sided hydronephrosis in a horseshoe kidney. So the characteristics of a horseshoe kidney are kidneys which are situated at a lower level, more medially, with lower poles tilted closer to the spine. The pelvis is mal-rotated and lower calyx faces inwards. The isthmus joining the lower poles is seen across the third or fourth lumbar vertebrae, giving the horseshoe shape. Very commonly, hydronephrosis and stone formation are seen. Ectopic kidney. If a kidney is found to be located at an abnormal site, it is termed as an ectopic kidney. The left kidney is not in its normal position, but it is seen at a lower level in the pelvis but at the same side. This is due to failure of the kidney to ascend to its normal position. During development, the kidney forms in the pelvis and then migrates upwards to its normal position. If this movement is arrested, kidney remains in the pelvis. Now I have outlined the kidneys. Note that the pelvis is facing laterally, so the kidney is also malrotated. This is an ectopic kidney. In this X-ray, once again the left kidney is missing in its normal position, but it is seen on the right side below the normal right kidney. That is, it has crossed over to the opposite side. This is termed as a crossed ectopic kidney. If we inspect the bladder, we can see that the lower ureter is in its normal position on the left side. The ureteric opening is at its normal site. Only the kidney has crossed over. This is a crossed ectopic kidney. Note the right kidney above and left kidney below, both on the same side. Sometimes the kidney not only crosses over to the opposite side but is fused to the opposite kidney, forming a long double kidney mass. Note the two fused kidneys on the right side. There is a single long kidney mass. This is a crossed and fused ectopic kidney. It has to be differentiated from a hypertrophic right kidney due to absent left kidney. However, visualization of normal lower ureter will solve the problem. This is another case of crossed fused ectopic kidneys. Note that the left kidney is absent from its normal position, while on the right side there are two pelvic ileal systems with the left kidney fused to the lower pole of the right kidney. This is a case of crossed unfused ectopic kidney. The left kidney is lying in the right lower abdomen. Note the two separate kidneys and ureters. The left ureter then crosses over to open normally in the bladder. Another common congenital anomaly is double pelvis and double ureter. In this IVP, note the emergence of two ureters from the right kidney. The ureter lying medially drains the upper calyx separately, while the other ureter drains the middle and lower calyces. This is a double renal pelvis and ureter. The ureters will usually join in the lower thirds before reaching the bladder, and they open through a single ureteric opening, but sometimes they may enter the bladder separately. In this IVP, the left kidney shows a double pelvis, but the ureter is single. Upper calyx has a separate pelvis, and the middle and lower calyces have an independent pelvis. This is a double pelvis with single ureter. This is another IVP showing left kidney with double pelvis and double ureter. As we trace the ureters down, they join to form a single ureter at the lower end. In this IVP, the lower portion of the left ureter appears dilated. Note the lower end of the left ureter. It is dilated and gives a characteristic cobra head appearance. This is a ureterocele. A ureterocele occurs due to congenital atresia of the ureteric orifice with cystic enlargement of the intramural portion of the ureter. This is another X-ray showing a ureterocele. Note the dilated cyst-like lower end of the right ureter with the dye retained in the lower ureter also. It gives the appearance of a snake with a broadened head, termed as cobra head appearance. Ureterocele may be asymptomatic but is prone to urinary infections, stone formation and hydronephrosis. Large and abnormal stones at the lower end of the ureters is very suggestive of the presence of a ureterocele. A more common cause of ureteric obstruction is a ureteric stone. Note this stone at the level of the fourth lumbar vertebra. The IVP shows a hydroureter and hydronephrosis. The ureter proximal to the stone is dilated. Now we will come to study the bladder in IVP. This bladder shows a filling defect on its base which is uneven and irregular. This is a papillomatous growth in the bladder. It may be a benign papilloma or a papillary carcinoma. Note the irregular filling defect of a papilloma. The prostate may enlarge into the bladder and cause a filling defect. This is an enlarged median lobe of the prostate, casting a typical midline smooth filling defect which is convex upwards. The enlarged lateral lobes may cause a similar filling defect at the base if they are protruding into the bladder. This is another X-ray of a filling defect in the bladder. The left half of the bladder is not seen at all. There was a malignant growth in the bladder. It has shut off the left ureter with the result that on IVP there is no excretion of the dye on the left side, and the right ureteric orifice is also narrowed, so the right side also shows hydroureter and hydronephrosis. Bladder diverticulum is a complication of back pressure due to chronic obstruction at the bladder neck or in the urethra. In this X-ray, the green arrow points to the smooth rounded filling defect at the bladder base caused by a benign enlargement of prostate. The bladder outline is irregular due to cystitis and trabeculae formation, and the diverticulum is shown by the red arrow. The diverticulum is connected to the bladder by a very narrow neck, and this is a pulsion diverticulum. This X-ray shows a bladder diverticulum that is as big as the bladder. The blue arrow points to the narrow connection between the bladder and the diverticulum. A diverticulum is prone to develop infection and stone formation. In this X-ray, the green arrow points to the urinary bladder, which is showing changes of chronic cystitis, that is irregular border, while the blue arrow points to a diverticulum. The common causes of bladder diverticulum are bladder neck hypertrophy, prostatic enlargement, stricture urethra, and posterior urethral valves. Urethrogram. This is a normal micturating cystourethrogram. Let us note the anatomy of the urethra. This is the prostatic urethra showing verumontanum. Next to it is the membranous urethra, followed by the bulbous and perineal urethra up to the base of the penis. And lastly, this is the penile urethra. Many a times, the dye enters and displays Cowper's glands, especially when there is a distal obstruction. This urethrogram shows a short stricture at the bulbomembranous junction. This urethrogram shows a stricture in the perineal urethra. This urethrogram shows a stricture at the base of the penis, that is at the pinobulbar junction. It is a short segment stricture. A stricture may be affecting a small segment of the urethra or a long segment of the urethra. This is a short segment stricture affecting a very small segment. This is a long segment stricture of the urethra affecting a longer segment. So, after identifying the stricture, you must note the length of the stricture. This is a micturating cystourethrogram showing a short segment stricture of the pinobulbar junction with dilatation of the proximal urethra. Posterior urethral valves. In the micturating cystourethrogram of this child, note that the bladder is grossly distended and the urine flow is obstructed at the lower end of the prostatic urethra. The prostatic urethra is dilated and elongated and ends abruptly with a convex lower border, which is bulging downwards. This is a classical appearance of posterior urethral valves, the commonest and most severe form of obstructive uropathy in infants. This is another micturating cystourethrogram in a child. Note the dilated prostatic urethra with a sharp convex lower border. In this view, the red arrow points to a bladder diverticulum which is formed due to a back pressure. This is another typical picture of posterior urethral valves, but here the back pressure is passed on to the ureters by associated vesico-ureteric reflux. Note in this micturating cystourethrogram the retrograde filling of bilateral hydronephrosis and hydroureters. This is another X-ray showing posterior urethral valves, a dilated prostatic urethra, and a large bladder with two diverticuli, and also bilateral hydroureter and hydronephrosis. Barium study of the GI tract. This will be studied under three headings: barium swallow, barium meal, and barium enema. Barium swallow is the radiological study of the pharynx and esophagus after giving a thick bolus of barium to swallow. In this X-ray, we can see the obstruction to the passage of the barium by a mass in the esophagus. The stricture starts abruptly at the point marked by the arrow, and the shadow makes about 90 degrees angle or even more acute angle with the esophageal wall. This feature is termed as shouldering and is diagnostic of a malignant growth. The segment with narrowing has irregular margins due to mucosal destruction, and when it is in the center of the mass, it gives a typical apple core appearance, like the cut surface of an apple. Now here we see an apple core on the right side, and note the similarity in appearance with the barium swallow. This is another X-ray showing an obstruction in the middle third of the esophagus. Note the shouldering, which is diagnostic of a malignant obstruction, and the irregular narrowing. Now study the proximal esophagus. In a malignant growth, proximal segment is not grossly dilated because of the short duration of the stricture and due to infiltration of the esophageal wall. This barium swallow shows obstruction at the lower end of the esophagus with long irregular narrowing. No barium has entered the stomach, indicating a total block. In close-up view, note the shouldering and the irregular narrowing. In this barium swallow, the barium has outlined the tracheobronchial tree. This is an advanced case of carcinoma of esophagus, infiltrating the trachea and forming a tracheoesophageal fistula or TO fistula. The blue arrow points to the irregular narrowing of the esophagus, and the vertical green arrow shows the tracheobronchial tree. On careful examination in oblique position, the fistula is demonstrated. Note the shouldering and irregular narrowing of the esophagus above, and the tracheoesophageal fistula shown by the horizontal green arrow. So the characteristics of a malignancy of esophagus are shouldering or abrupt start of the growth, irregular narrowing due to mucosal destruction, less dilated proximal esophagus, and sometimes TO fistula. Benign strictures. Benign strictures are most often corrosive strictures caused by ingestion of chemical corrosives. In this X-ray, note the features of a benign stricture. The proximal esophagus is dilated, especially if the stricture is long standing. Then there is a funnel shaped narrowing, which leads to a long, narrow, strictured segment. There is no shouldering. The stricture narrows down gradually, and its lining is smooth as the mucosa is intact. This is another stricture with no shouldering, smooth mucosa of the strictured segment, and marked proximal dilatation. This is probably a benign stricture. So the characteristics of a benign stricture are a long segment stricture with smooth walls, funnel shaped upper end merging gradually with the dilated esophagus without shouldering, and proximal dilatation of the esophagus. Achalasia cardia. Achalasia cardia is a congenital functional obstruction of the lower end of the esophagus due to defective parasympathetic innervation. In achalasia cardia, the esophagus is grossly dilated, and in severe cases it may even become tortuous. Note the grossly dilated esophagus in this barium swallow. Now let us study the lower end or cardia. Here we see a smooth but abrupt narrowing at the cardia with a pencil-shaped tip which is directed almost horizontally towards the left. This is described as the bird's beak sign. This is another X-ray of a child showing a grossly dilated esophagus with smooth pencil-shaped narrowing at the cardia. It looks exactly like a bird's beak. Also, note the absence of air bubble in the stomach, which is a feature of achalasia cardia. This is another child showing achalasia cardia. Note the dilatation of the esophagus with sudden but smooth narrowing. On a plain X-ray, the dilated esophagus may be seen as a mediastinal soft tissue shadow to the right of the midline. Note the large soft tissue shadow along the right of the mediastinum. It may also show a air fluid level at the upper end of the fluid contents of the esophagus. Another important feature to note is the absence of air in the stomach. Though not seen in this X-ray, the fundic gas bubble is invariably absent. Now let us see the barium swallow of the same patient. Note the gross dilatation of the esophagus, diagnostic of achalasia cardia. Now note the smooth and abrupt beak-like narrowing at the cardia directed horizontally, making it a bird's beak. So the features of achalasia cardia are a grossly dilated esophagus, beak-like smooth pencil-shaped narrowing at the cardia which is directed horizontally, and absence of fundic gas bubble. Hiatus hernia. Hiatus hernia is a herniation of the stomach through the esophageal hiatus. There are two types of hiatus hernias. Sliding type, where the stomach with the cardia is pulled up into the thorax, and the rolling or paraesophageal type, where the stomach herniates by the side of the esophagus. In this barium swallow, we can see the stomach with its characteristic mucosal folds lying above the level of the diaphragm. The gastroesophageal junction is lying in the chest. This is a sliding type of hiatus hernia where the cardiac end of the stomach protrudes through the diaphragmatic hiatus into the thorax. Note that the esophagus is slightly dilated and the cardia shown by the arrow is narrowed. This is another case of sliding type of hiatus hernia. Note the normal but short esophagus, cardia, and a portion of the stomach lying in the chest. This is another view of the same patient showing the stomach, cardia, and esophagus. In a small hiatus hernia, the gastric mucosal folds will be seen passing through the hiatus and converging above the diaphragm. The sliding type of hiatus hernia is associated with gastroesophageal reflux, and repeated attacks of reflux esophagitis in the long run result in a stricture at the cardia. Note in this X-ray the stricture at the cardia with dilatation of the proximal esophagus. The cardia is lying in the chest above the diaphragm, and above it the esophagus dilates abruptly. In a rolling type of hiatus hernia or paraesophageal hernia, there is no gastroesophageal reflux as cardia remains in the abdomen, but the fundus of the stomach rolls up by the side of the esophagus and comes to lie in the thorax. Note the thin normal esophagus descending on the right side of the stomach and the stomach which has herniated upwards by its side. On plain X-ray, a air fluid level may be seen in the thorax above the esophageal hiatus overlapping the cardiac shadow. Esophageal diverticulum. The esophageal diverticuli are of two types: pulsion diverticulum with a narrow neck and traction diverticulum with a broad neck. Now note this small diverticulum with a narrow neck and a broader diverticulum. This is a pulsion diverticulum due to pouting out of the mucosa. It is not covered by muscle layers. In a close-up view, note this diverticulum with narrow neck arising from the upper esophagus. This diverticulum in the middle third of the esophagus has a wide and broad base. This is a traction diverticulum. It is common in the middle third of the esophagus near the tracheal bifurcation. This is another X-ray showing two diverticuli in the middle third of the esophagus. The base is broad and the smaller diverticulum shows the typical narrow apex. These are traction diverticuli. So the features of the two types of esophageal diverticuli are pulsion diverticuli showing narrow neck and broad body, and traction diverticuli showing broad neck and narrow apex. Esophageal varices. Esophageal varices are dilated and tortuous submucosal veins in the lower third of the esophagus as seen in portal hypertension. Note the ribbon-like knobby radiolucent areas which represent the elevations caused by the veins and are not coated by barium. The varices are best demonstrated by using a thick paste of barium and patient in Trendelenburg position. Note the irregular, knobby filling defects of esophageal varices. This is another barium swallow showing the lower third of the esophagus with elongated radiolucent filling defects caused by tortuous veins. In this X-ray, we can see more clearly the long, dilated and tortuous veins seen as ribbon-like radiolucencies. This is another X-ray showing large tortuous veins in the lower esophagus. The barium lines the mucosa in between the varices. So the characteristic radiological features of esophageal varices are bubbly, elongated radiolucent defects, while barium coats the rest of the esophageal wall. A congenital esophageal atresia may occur with or without a tracheoesophageal communication. It is diagnosed by introducing a small amount of thin Omnipaque solution through an infant feeding tube at the point where it gets obstructed. The arrow points to the blind pouch of esophagus in the upper thorax. The esophagus ends there. Now, if you look at the abdomen, you can see gas in the intestinal coils, which indicates that the lower part of the esophagus is communicating with the trachea. That is, this is esophageal atresia with a TO fistula. You can also see aspiration pneumonitis in the right upper lobe. In this case, once again, we see a blind esophagus in the upper thorax in a newborn child. The abdomen, however, shows no gas shadows. It means that there is no communication between the lower esophagus and the trachea. So this is esophageal atresia without tracheoesophageal communication. This is X-ray of another child showing a blind esophagus. You can see the infant feeding tube and the blind convex lower end of the esophagus. The abdomen shows gas in the intestines. So this is esophageal atresia with a tracheoesophageal fistula. So the radiological features of esophageal atresia are a blind esophagus and presence of gas in the stomach and intestines if there is a tracheoesophageal fistula. Esophagus is a very common site for lodging of swallowed foreign bodies, especially in children who accidentally swallow coins, pins, rings and practically anything swallowable. Note this ring in the upper end of the esophagus. It could also be lying in the trachea. A lateral view will show whether it is lying in the trachea or esophagus. It clearly shows the radiolucent shadow of the trachea lying anteriorly and the ring is in the esophagus between the trachea and the vertebral column. Here we see a coin in the upper third of the esophagus. To confirm its position in the esophagus, observe the lateral X-ray carefully. The horizontal red arrow points to the air in the trachea lying anterior to the coin. So the coin is in the esophagus.